I'm Danielle Smith with the Alberta Enterprise Group. We're collaborating with Common Sense Edmonton to interview candidates for the upcoming municipal election for Edmonton City Council. And joining me now is the incumbent for Ward 1, Andrew Knack. Thank you so much for being with me, Andrew.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Now tell me the new name of your ward.
Certainly. So the new ward name is called Nakota Isga.
Do you know what it means? Does it have any particular relevance to that area of town?
It means the people, and so it's meant to be a bit more broad, but it's I love that. I love that phrasing, that it's the people, and that's what this is all about. And municipal government is about the people.
You've been on council for a couple of terms. When you look back on your record, what are you most proud of?
I think there's a few things I would flag. I think there's, when it comes to specific projects, something like the Valley Line West LRT was something that I started working on even before I was on council. That's what got me involved in municipal government back in 2007. And to see that project at a state now where the contract is signed, the work has started, this is very much a transformational project for people in the West End. We have been waiting for decades. And I don't just mean 4 decades, I mean 4 for like the number 4 as well, because we have seen LRT build out in our city, but not to this part of the city. And so I think that's something I've been really excited about and worked quite a bit on. I think from there, there's a few other things. We've talked a lot about, and especially now with the economy and how things have been going. One thing I don't talk about a lot, I usually write about it in my blog posts that nobody reads. It's the sharing the information about how I've actually brought forward motions that have successfully reduced spending in our city, that have allowed us to either use that money to other priorities or used it to actually bring costs down and our budget down. And when it comes to our mature neighborhoods, this might sound really small, but I think it's a really big one, because there was a lot of conversation over the years when I was running for council about the condition of things like our back alleys. Our front streets, our local roads and our sidewalks were getting upgraded by neighborhood renewal, but our back alleys were left in this state of disrepair. And so when I first got onto council, I brought forward a proposal to create a back alley renewal program for all of our mature neighborhoods. And council officially accepted that and started the program back in 2019. And so over the course, it's going to take time, but we're going to reconstruct all of our back alleys across the city into proper roadways that people can more safely use. And I would say the last thing I feel really strongly about is my engagement with the constituents, because it's something I really focused on when I campaigned back in 2013, but also 2017. I go door knocking not just during an election season. I go door knocking at least once a month in the ward to go talk to people. I host town halls. And since the pandemic started, I've been doing virtual town halls every single week as a way to stay connected to people. And the purpose of that is that in municipal government, like in all of politics, we're not always all going to agree. But oftentimes, if we engage each other and are going into it with an open mind, we can learn from each other, better understand our perspectives, and make more informed decisions. And I feel that's something I've really focused on over my time on council, which is to bring as many people together as possible, to hear from as many people as possible. And I hope I've set the standard for engagement going forward, and I'd like to see that continue.
Well, it's interesting because I know your name was being floated as a potential candidate for mayor. Now you have chosen to run again for council. Maybe you can tell us if you actually did seriously consider running for mayor, and what were the considerations you had about why you decided that council was another term on council was what you wanted to do instead.
Yes, so I was seriously considering it. We had put together a team really starting last summer in 2020, had really started to consider putting my name forward, brought together the right individuals to build out what that type of campaign would look like. Started building out my platform and wrote it back in late last year. And what changed is that as we got closer to the end of the year and the beginning of this year, I had a chance to really sit down virtually with almost all of the candidates that were going to be running for mayor. Because when I was first thinking about it, there weren't many people who had been floating their names. It was still early, and I wasn't necessarily seeing or hearing names that that I felt would represent what I was hoping to work on. But as we got closer to that, and as I started to see new people announce or start, kicking tires, I reached out to them, wanted to understand what was important to them. If they were to be elected as mayor, what issues would they want to work on? How do they see working together with other members of council? Because we're going to have a lot of turnover. And I found that more often than not, with most of the candidates I spoke with, my values generally aligned. Not completely, of course, we're not always going to agree on everything, but I felt confident enough that in the people who were putting their name forward and how they were going to approach serving as mayor, for me to reconsider and look at the amount of turnover that was going to happen on council. We're going to have at least 5 new members of council. And I thought I could provide the same type of value that I was provided back when I first was elected in 2013. When I was elected in 2013, we had Brian Anderson, who had been around for 15 years, and Ed Gibbons, who had been around for 12. And we had a number of other councillors who had been around for 6, including the current mayor and Ben Henderson and Tony Catarina. And all of those individuals, even though we didn't agree on every issue, wanted to help us succeed. They wanted to help 5 new members of council better learn how we do things, learn how to put forward motions, work through the process. And I greatly appreciated that guidance and expertise. And I think there's a role that I can play with as much turnover as we're going to experience for those new members of council. And beyond that, there are some local issues we still would like to work on, but I also believe it's important to have that mix of new voices with new perspectives, while also having those experienced voices who can help guide those people into providing the change that they're campaigning on.
Sometimes, you get elected as an independent and you do have to have 7 people agree with you to get a motion passed. Sometimes that can be very fractious, but what is it that's working in the Edmonton Council relationship?
I think it comes back to, we very much embrace the fact that we are not partisan. Sure, you can look at city council and generally you could probably put us somewhere on the political spectrum, but then there are certain votes that come out and you're like, well, wait a second, that's not what I expected from this person. How did those 2 people agree? And I think a lot of us realize that when we go into this, there's not a true ideological way to deal with all of the local issues in the same way you might have provincially or federally. Right? There's not necessarily a right wing or a left wing way to clear snow off the road. How you set policy, how much money you put into that might be a bit more ideological, but not the actual implementation of something like that. And so I think what has gone well is that we know that at any given time, there's people who will have different expertise that we don't have, and we actively listen to one another. Very often we go into the debates not having made up our mind. And I think that allows us to make better decisions. I have watched some other city councils where it is far more fractured, and it makes me really appreciate the work that members of council have done over the years. And I think that's also a testament. I do want to give great credit to our mayor, who, regardless of whether people like or dislike his policies, he is, and this is the most boring thing for 99% of the people, but he's one of the most effective chairs I have ever seen in a meeting. He knows how to knows when to bring in the rules, and this is the way that we're supposed to follow the rules. And there are other times where he doesn't always have that strict interpretation. If somebody wants to bring an idea forward that maybe we could, bat away with a procedural process motion, he said, no, he says, let's debate it. I think it's the right thing to do to debate this, even if it maybe isn't officially meet the criteria for what we would expect in a debate. So that's, I think, why council has generally been really effective. We've all had the opportunity to bring about change. We don't all use it at all times, but it's always been there in the time I've been on council.
You're right. I mean, I guess we'll see what the new tone is setting from the top with a new leader coming in at the mayoral level. There is also a tone that gets set from the administration, though. And we recently weighed in on an issue in Lewis Estates about a family that wanted to beautify their backyard area, and they were getting the gears from bylaw. And I thought your approach, look, can we figure out a way to resolve this? We obviously don't want people going out into every park and beautifying and putting things in, but there did seem to need to be an exception here since the neighborhood seemed to support it. So explain to me a little bit about that. I'm trying to understand, in the environment that we're in right now, why would that have been a bylaw enforcement priority? And how did it get onto your desk for you to intervene?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, because this area, it's called Potter Greens Park, although I think on Google Maps they call it Christopher Cruz Park. It's not the official name, but it's a stormwater pond. And there's been a couple who's lived there for some time, and actually over the last almost decade, I think it's been 9 years, that they've been slowly putting in these little improvements, bird feeders, planting in some flowers, putting up some benches, just some little improvements that I think really make that a much more beautiful space, because stormwater ponds aren't always the most beautiful thing in the world. And there was a bylaw complaint that came in. Somebody had raised it. This had been going on for 9 years. It never came up, but then suddenly it did. And so bylaw, understandably, has to respond. We can't just ignore a call. The bylaw officers are not allowed to do that. So they went out and they saw these improvements. And the way our parkland bylaw is designed, we can't just allow people, willy-nilly to, throw up any type of improvement they want. And the rationale behind that makes sense, because what if you plant something that impacts the vegetation or wildlife? What if you do something that does impact the functionality of the stormwater pond? Those are serious things that could have an impact. But what I found out is that as bylaw went out, they didn't actually find a safety issue. They didn't find an environmental issue, but they were required to look at that bylaw and it says, you shall not do this. And, fortunately, all it took was a call to say, can we look at this and use a bit of discretion? If it's not creating an environmental issue, if it's not creating a safety issue, this is maybe one of those scenarios that we can do the process in reverse, because we have a parkland improvement process in the city. We work with our community leagues and our neighborhood resource coordinators in the city to do those type of things. And since it wasn't causing harm, I felt like, can't we just go with that way instead of tearing it all down? They spent 9 years doing this. I was there just a couple of days ago, and it was gorgeous. And fortunately, they did exercise the discretion. So I do want to give our administration credit. It took a quick phone call to say, I can't tell them you have to overturn this or go the other route. That's not actually what councillors are allowed to do. We as individuals can't overturn their decisions. But we can say, hey, do you mind taking another look at this? Because I think it might need a bit of a more nuanced approach. And to their credit, they took that nuanced approach, and they're going to work with the community league to formalize those, but everything got to stay, and I'm glad to see it was left in place.
You know what I found in speaking with council members? It seems like there's a real opportunity to make specific projects or specific improvements in your own area, but it becomes a lot more difficult when you're looking at how to create the overall direction and structure for the city as a whole when it comes to spending and taxes. And I want to understand a little bit about why I have that perception, especially since you said you've done a lot on trying to find some of these spending efficiencies. So let's first talk about the level of spending, because a recent city auditor's report showed that operating spending has increased above the rate of inflation and population growth, 36% above in the last 20 years. Do you think that that's a problem, or do you think that there's some rationale for that? And what, if anything, can be done about it?
So I actually think, oddly enough, the answer is both. And I don't mean to give this as that political play both sides answer, but it's that if you go look through that audit and you really review it in detail, a lot of what drove that was the capital investment that was made in the city over the last really 2 decades. So new recreation centers, new fire halls, new services and amenities that were that helped manage the fairly rapid growth that we were experiencing in the city of Edmonton. And so it's really hard to look at those things and say, well, we shouldn't have built this fire hall, or we shouldn't have built this rec center, or we shouldn't have built this library. Those are all things that we absolutely needed in that. And I think the audit does a very good job of breaking that down. But now we are in a very different financial time. Mm-hmm. Growth, while still happening, is slower than before. And so I think, and this really started 3 years ago, back in 2019, where we started to see the trend in the city of Edmonton shift from fairly large tax increases each and every year. If you go from 2009 to 2018, the average tax increase in the city of Edmonton was 3.3%. So well above the rate of inflation. But if you look from 2019, 20, and 21, so we only have 3 years to go on, but that's where I think we've started to see this shift. Our average has been 1.3%, so below the rate of inflation, with this year being the first year that council did not approve an increase for the first time in 24 years. So I think that, yes, it was absolutely necessary over those 20 years. The programs, so not only were we dealing with growth, we were also doing massive increases in investment in renewal. Programs like neighborhood renewal, which that started in 2009, and every year for 10 years, there was a 1.5% increase on top of anything else just to fund that. So if you look at the money that's been put into renewal into our city, it was done to catch up on decades of a lack of investment so that we could finally start bringing up the overall condition of infrastructure. But as we go forward, I think what you're going to see is maintain the maintenance budgets. Don't cut those back, because we saw what happens when you cut maintenance budgets. You know, at a time in the 90s when we had many years of 9 or 0% increases, we stopped doing visual inspections of our deep sewer infrastructure. Guess what happens when we restarted it? Turns out that deep sewer infrastructure was in really rough shape. So we're going to maintain that. But what we're probably not going to see is large projects over the next couple of years. We don't have the budget to do that. So if we hope to do, you know, and there's a rec center that we still want to build in the west end of the city, but we're not going to be able to do it on our own. So, you know, I did a motion to go look at nonprofit partners or other partners to see if we can work together to build that. That's what Calgary's been doing for years, but that's how I see us advancing. I don't think we'll see large increases. If anything, I expect we'll have at least another year of zero in 2022. And then even if things start going up, I think you'll see it in that rate of inflation or below, because the appetite, and really more importantly, the ability for people and businesses to pay large increases is not there, not coming out of this pandemic, not coming out of a really challenging economic condition in this province.
Okay, so I see what you're saying. So try to keep the level of increases below the rate of inflation. What about for businesses in particular? Do you think that are they paying an appropriate share of the tax burden, or do you think it is falling too heavy on them?
I actually think the city of Edmonton's done a better job than, and I'll use the city of Calgary as the comparison, because we've seen Calgary over the last couple of years shift the percentage that goes that's being paid from residential to non-residential. So they've tried to shift it from non-res to the residential side, which has resulted in some fairly large increases in the city. I think this year was one of them in particular, or it was last year. But we were actually at the ratio that Calgary was moving to. So we were already there. And so I think we've done a better job of maintaining that balance. And at the same time, now you're going to see a greater investment in some of the work that I think needs to happen for our business community. So I didn't mention it in one of your first questions around what I'm proud of, but I would also flag that we have a lot of unserviced industrial areas in the city of Edmonton, the largest of which is in this ward, the Winterburn industrial area. And we annexed it back in '82, and it was, again, fully unserviced, and it has existed in that state this entire time. Meanwhile, the taxes that those businesses have paid are only about 10% less as a fully serviced industrial park just on the other side of the Henday. So a few years ago, I said, it's time to make up our mind. We either have to leave it as is, but then charge an appropriate tax rate, or start to bring in full services. And to council's credit, when I brought it forward, they agreed that it's time to bring in full services to these industrial areas. So again, it's going to take time to do it, but we're making the investment into our non-residential taxes or properties, so into our business community, so that they know that that money that they are paying is also going to directly benefit them as well as the homeowners in our city.
Let me ask you a bit about growth, and there's sort of two aspects to deal with it, with the potential of growing to 2 million people, I believe by 2050. You'll have to correct me if I've got the time frame incorrect, but also when you've got a growing city, attracting more people, more businesses, that also boosts revenues. So getting the economy ticking on all cylinders is very important. Tell me what you see. Do you see some bright spots, or do you see some things that council will need to do to improve the environment to attract business?
I think it's both. I think, we have seen some bright spots. There was a recent announcement of a hydrogen plant that's going to be coming into the city of Edmonton, a massive investment into the northeast part of our city. And that's really encouraging. I think that industry has a lot of potential, not just in Edmonton, but in the Edmonton region. So I love seeing that. I think we have some areas of opportunity, though. You look at our innovation and tech sector, and while we've worked on it, we haven't maintained our same level of growth as someone, and I'm going to go back to Calgary because they've done some pretty concerted effort in investment in that area and have seen the return on that investment start to pay off. As our city, I think we're missing some of that right now. We've got, I think, the best post-secondary, and I'm talking the best post-secondary institutions, like all of them here, between U of A and MacEwan and NAIT and Norquest and Concordia and King's. We've got such a fantastic setup and diverse range of institutions. So we're producing amazing talent, but we're still missing the foreign direct investment that a lot of other larger cities see. And so I think we've made the changes to help begin to bring that in, but it's still an area of opportunity that exists for us. I also think that as a city, we still create some barriers for some of these startup businesses. And I've always used this example because I think it's the most, it's just a small but a very good way of explaining where I think a gap existed within us as an organization. I remember a few years ago, I was at the Research and Technology Park on the south side of our city and met with a number of business owners who were doing their work out of that Research and Technology Park. And one in particular was a gentleman who had created an autonomous lawnmower and wanted to test it out with the city. But the city said, no, we have to go through a procurement process to be able to do this. Our reaction needs to be different when there's a startup. We should have said, great, we'd like to buy 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, a small number. We're going to test those out on some of our hardest to maintain areas. We're going to see how it goes. And then if it works, then we can do the procurement, because that's when we'd have to if we did it on a larger scale. But you'd allow that person to have their first customer as the city of Edmonton, in the city that they want to build their business. We finally did it a few years later, but there was a long time, I would say, in the city where we were hesitant to allow ourselves to try out things. And we've still got work to do there, but the culture is starting to shift. And I think with Innovate Edmonton doing the work that they're doing, and with some of the people we have in our administration now who understand the need to support startups, we're going to allow ourselves to find new opportunity. And
That's it. Yeah.
Sorry. And I was just going to say the last thing I would flag is something I was working on with the Alberta Urban Municipality Association, the AUMA. And when I got involved about 2 years ago, one of the first things I said to the executive committee and then the board is I was surprised that the AUMA doesn't have an economic development committee. We have safe and healthy communities, we have environmental, we have all these committees, we had an infrastructure and energy, but there wasn't a broader economic focus. And so we created up a task force. We brought folks from the Alberta Chamber, from economic development agencies across the province. We developed a report, and now what's going to happen is that the AUMA is going to have a dedicated economic development committee so that municipalities across the province can work together more collaboratively. Because I would argue there's a lot of things we can do and the region can do and Calgary can do, But this is a global economy, and we do need to be operating as a province to be competitive on a global scale. If the city of Toronto needs to partner with a city like Waterloo to help advance their technology and innovation ecosystem, what chance do any of us have in this province going it alone? We need to be more collaborative and deliberate in that work. And so those are some of the ways I think we continue to work on it, while at the same time I do see some really positive things starting up.
Those are all great examples. The one I wanted to just zero in on, just to get your views on it, is one of the things that Calgary's done through Calgary Economic Development Agency is set aside $100 million for business attraction, so direct subsidies to attract businesses. Do you support that kind of approach?
You know, I struggle a bit with the municipality doing it. At the same time, when others are doing it, you almost need to be able to be competitive. So I feel we're caught in this place where I would rather see certain tax incentives from the provincial government to help advance certain industries. But I do think we need to be willing to put some money into this. If we want to prove to the broader global community that Edmonton is a great spot to do business, it's one thing to have the regulatory environment to do that, and we're slowly working on chipping away at that red tape that exists. But I also think you need to occasionally be willing to put in money to help bring folks there, and that ideally, but it would have to be done with a clear understanding that we know we're going to see a return on that investment. Putting in money for the sake of money to attract businesses can result in a race to the bottom if you're not careful. And that's what our region had been doing for far too long. We were racing to the bottom. And again, something I'll give a lot of credit for with really all of our regional partners in the Edmonton Metropolitan Region Board is they have understood that we've been fighting each other for the scraps instead of recognizing that if we are working together and doing a proper shared investment for shared benefit approach, we can then go and attract many other businesses that have been overlooking this region for years and decades because we've been too busy bickering over these small little things like that. It was such a terrible approach that is now really starting to shift. And we've used the terminology hunting as a pack a lot more. And I think it's very fitting in this because we recognize now that, in this case, that hydrogen plant announcement isn't just good for Edmonton, it benefits everyone around this region. And just like when something gets set up in one of our county partners and or another municipality, that does benefit us because we have new people moving into our region. So yes, we need to put in money, but it needs to be thoughtful, and it's not just putting in money for the sake of putting in money.
All right. I meant to ask you this question. The sense I'm getting from you is that the way to get new revenue in is to get new business paying new taxes. But I should ask the question directly about new taxation powers, because that emerges in other municipalities from time to time. It emerges in the conversation about city charters. It may emerge in the conversation about the regional board. And so I'm putting it to you. Do you think there needs to be new taxation powers?
I don't think so. I think it would be nice to have a proper fiscal framework in place with all municipalities. We had a city charter that had a clear financial plan for Calgary and Edmonton that was, by the way, approved by all parties. It was a unanimous vote originally. So it was brought in by the NDP, but also approved by the UCP. And then things changed, and the fiscal portion of our city charter was removed after the new government came in. And so now they're working on the local government fiscal framework. And so I think if we have a proper fiscal framework in place that treats municipalities as true partners, I don't think we need that. But that's a big asterisk that exists right now because I don't know if we're there yet. And I think we need to recognize, we keep talking as a province about the need for a proper partnership with the country, with our federal government. We talk about a fair deal. We talk about these important things, and yet we're not doing that with our cities. The province isn't doing that with the cities. So it's frustrating to hear that language saying, we want this from you, federal government, but then we don't want to do the same thing at a municipal level.
Well, would you suggest then that the province should vacate the education property tax room and then maybe reduce the amount of transfers so that the own source revenue is enough to cover more of the obligations that you have?
It's like you read my platform. I haven't even put it up yet. Yeah, I think that is a good example of an area where if they give up that education tax that we are collecting on their behalf, but then get rid of all the grants and the bureaucracy that exists for all these different things that we apply for, that's a simpler way to do things. So it reduces red tape, which is good for all of us. It's a way to actually allow municipalities to have greater control. And I think it just speeds up things too, and it allows us to be more thoughtful about what we're investing. Because I do still get frustrated about, there's occasionally times where money comes in for something that you're like, I mean, it's nice to have, but that actually isn't top of our priority list right now. And so I think taking that education tax and handing it directly to the municipalities helps remove the need for a lot of operating grants and different types of funds. There might still be a few for some really large projects, but beyond that, I think it just provides more flexibility for everyone involved, and it's better for the provincial government.
Well, and I like the idea. Now, here's a question for you, because there is an equalization referendum coming forward by the provincial government. Why not put forward a similar, like a comparable type of referendum to get at this issue of vacating the education tax room?
I guess I'm sort of the thinking that, I hope that that's just something the provincial government realizes is the right thing to do. This is what municipalities have been talking about. And I'm not just talking about Edmonton and Calgary. Now that I've been involved with the AUMA for a while, I see how much the other municipalities of various sizes are advocating for that type of stability as well. So I don't know. I feel like I scoff a little bit at the referendum, not because it's not an important conversation. It's just it's not the right way to solve a problem. So if we all vote 100% in favor, nothing's guaranteed to change. And so I don't actually know what that accomplishes. Frankly, I'd rather use that money and have a proper, robust engagement with municipalities about the right way forward on the fiscal framework. I think that would set us all up for a greater success. So I don't know, referendums for the sake of making a political point, I don't think have as much value as a referendum that is meant to truly gauge an opinion on an important topic where there will be a real decision coming out of it.
Okay. Thank you for that. Let me stay with the issue of spending for a minute, because you had mentioned how excited you are about the Valley Line West. The Valley Line Southeast has had multiple significant delays during its construction. I wonder if you have some insights now that you've seen some of the reasons for the delays. Is there a way to approach these big projects differently? Because you've got Valley Line West, Metro Line Northwest, Capital Line South. It'd be nice to have some learning that came out of some of the issues that you've seen. What would you recommend?
Oh, there's actually been so many learnings from some of our major project failures that are still not nearly as well communicated as they should be. And so if you'll bear with me, just a quick bit of history. We had our city auditor do an audit on the three major project failures back in 2015, and that was the Metro Line, the Groat Road Bridge, and the Walterdale Bridge. Significant projects that had fairly large delays. And from that came some fairly significant changes to how we manage large-scale projects, to the way we report on that, and just to the overall process. So we made staffing changes that many people don't realize. There was like 70% turnover in the leadership roles of one department because of some of those issues. Council prior to that hadn't been getting regular reporting on the status of capital projects. We now not only have a public report every 3 months on the status of all those projects, there is a public website that anyone can visit today to look at the status of every single project. And we'll come back to that in a moment, but I'll mention the last change we made, or one of the last changes, is that we sort of returned to an old model that used to exist in the city. We used to have a chief engineer, and projects would all go through that one department so that you knew there was some consistency, even though when you're building a bridge compared to building a building or building a road, those require different expertise. But yet, if you apply a similar approach for project management, you can ensure greater consistency. So we created the Integrated Infrastructure Services Department. It was reformed from the existing staff. And we have seen a pretty significant change, because if you went to that website today, it's building.edmonton.ca, you would see right at the top that of all of the capital projects currently underway right now in our city, 79% of them are on or ahead of schedule, and 93% of them are on or under budget. Really impressive results that nobody knows.
Well, they do now.
Well, they do now, but I stress it because I think people think that most of our projects still fail, when in fact that is not the case. And on top of that, you might ask, well, if you're listing all capital projects, the ones that are probably on time and on schedule are the $1 million ones. What about the big ones? Well, in fact, we break out those big ones in our separate report that comes to council. And in fact, those results are almost identical to the overall results. And finally, one of the changes that our integrated infrastructure services team made is the introduction of what's called our project development and delivery model, or PDDM. And what it's all about is that in the past, council used to approve the project budget and schedule only after completing the preliminary design work. So put that in an example of doing your basement in your home. So you might have somebody come down, take a look at your basement, give you a quote for how long it'll take and how much it'll cost. But until they actually remove the wall to see if there's a crack in the foundation, you don't really know how much it's going to cost. You don't really know how long it's going to take. Yet we were approving budgets and schedules with that, oh, well, this looks good. Here's what it will take. Now we do it with the more detailed approach. And while it's still early, because that only came into effect during this capital budget cycle, we break out the projects that are still being delivered under the legacy model and under the new model. And under the new model, we have even better performance than what I just mentioned. So there were a ton of learnings from the projects that failed. And we have already implemented them, and now we've seen the direct result of those changes.
All right, let me just make sure it's building.edmonton.ca if anybody wants to go check it out. Excellent. Let me talk to you about a couple of other items then, because when we're talking about, I want to talk to you about other development issues when we extend it out to looking at private development. So first of all, affordable housing means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Tell me, when I say affordable housing, what does that mean to you?
Well, when we use the term affordable housing as a city, that is the spectrum of permanent supportive housing, so 24/7 on-site supports for some of the hardest to house individuals in our city, all the way to market affordable housing. So, I usually try to break out, there's affordable housing, which is everything across that range, and then supportive housing, which is for those who need the greatest support. So when I think about affordable housing, I'm talking about it all.
Okay, so let's then ask about both of those things. So how do you feel about the city's plan to end homelessness? Is it working? Is there some tweaks that need to be made?
It is working for those who are not the hardest to house. So we know that model, that housing first approach, has housed many people over the last decade. But where the city has not been successful is our neighbors who are the hardest to house, those who've what we would typically say, those who've experienced chronic homelessness, who be dealing with trauma, who might be dealing with addictions, and the standard sort of affordable housing, or even the maybe support on site for 8 hours a day, that isn't enough. So that is where we haven't succeeded, and not because of the city. And we should always say this at the beginning, and this isn't meant to pass the buck, but housing is not actually a municipal responsibility. It is provincial and it's federal. So we're doing everything we can. In fact, the city just last year, we said, because we have been waiting on the 916 units of supportive housing, that permanent supportive housing, and that is the housing that will have the greatest overall impact. That will have the greatest overall impact on the individuals, because they'll be able to finally start recovering. But it will also have the greatest financial impact on both the city, from policing costs, and to the provincial government on healthcare costs and costs to the justice system if some of those folks are going through it. So we last year said, let's start reallocating some of our own money. And we are building, we are funding the construction of about 200 units of supportive housing in 5 areas across the city. What we need, though, is that's still only just over 20% of the way. The federal government, and I'll give them credit on this, is that in February, they were willing to put in funding and build another 420 units on top of what was announced. we have not been able to take advantage of that money yet because we are still waiting on the province to commit to the $6 million a year on operating. And why it is so frustrating is that we know that $6 million per year investment on operating will be more than paid back on healthcare and costs alone, because we have the numbers. We actually did a study for Ambrose Place in the city of Edmonton. So we studied the residents who were living on the streets 2 years before and then the 2 years after. And there were huge savings to be had from both a municipal side of things on the policing, because we didn't have to, many of these individuals were interacting with police 200 times a year. And on the provincial side, many of these individuals were in emergency rooms 200 nights a year. And so the amount that we would save by providing proper housing far outweighs the cost of actually doing it. So even if for a moment there's a person who says, well, I don't really care about housing people, which I don't imagine anyone like that exists. But let's say somebody only cares about spending in their governments, or that is their most important issue. Providing supportive housing will save everyone money. And so what do we need to do as a city? We've shared this information. They have these reports. It's not like this is hidden detail. We've preached this as much as we can. I actually think we might have to get to the point, if I was ever going to do a referendum question, back to one of the other ones, I would say, is it time for the province to turn over jurisdiction of housing to the municipalities?
Wow.
Because I think we know how to do it. We have been involved in this. We have great partnerships with our housing providers. We have the land available. That's what our contribution has been over the years. And I think we could solve this in just a few years. I mean, when Vancouver took it seriously a few years ago, they actually hired a company here in West Edmonton to go build 600 units of modular housing in 1 year. This doesn't have to take long. We can actually solve for the 916 units that we need. Those could be built in 2 years. We could actually end chronic homelessness in just 2 years because we would have that in place. But I don't know why. And to be clear, I'm not just blaming this provincial government, because the past one messed it up too. They put in a bit of money, but I'm going to blame them, and I'm going to blame even the PCs before. There was no provincial government over the last 10 to 15 years that has taken this issue seriously, and they could end things quickly and save money within just a few years. So.
Well, and I think you raise a good point about the cities having that expertise. And maybe that's another reason to open up the discussion of city charters. Maybe it's only the large cities that have the ability to do it.
Yeah.
It's a great point. Let's continue talking about development, though, because there is this tension between, do you densify and build up, or do you do Greenfield and build out? We've got 2 million people that may be within the borders of Edmonton. Is it by 2050? Is that the plan?
We didn't have a set timeline.
Okay.
We're assuming it could be there, but the plan's actually built just to say, when we hit 2 million, this is the city that it will be, whether it's 20 years from now or 40 years from now or 60 years from now.
Now, how do you look at the issue of Greenfield development? Because you are in a position where if Edmonton doesn't make the decision to allow for that, there's adjacent municipalities that people could choose to move to instead. And it does seem that the demand for single-family homes, maybe especially post-pandemic and post-COVID, seems like it's on the rise. So how do you balance those issues?
Well, you used the right word, the balance. The city has done a terrible job providing choice for people. So you don't make people, you don't densify a community by making it harder to build out in our Greenfield areas. You do it by making that easier to do in our existing communities. That is what the new city plan is all about. If I could summarize it in one word, it is all about choice. It is about letting people choose where they want to live, how they want to move, how they want to live their life. And if you look at most of our other guiding documents, we never provided choice. The vast majority of our growth was in outside the Henday, which is fine. If that's what people want, great. But make sure the regulatory environment exists in our mature neighborhoods so that people could choose to live here. I mean, I live in a neighborhood that is, got fairly low values in terms of when a property goes up for sale. I mean, a tear down home in my neighborhood's probably $330,000 at this point here. And I could go buy a brand new home outside the Henday for that money and it's bigger and it's ready to go. It might have a slightly smaller yard because new neighborhoods are far more dense actually than almost every one of our mature neighborhoods. But if you're a family that's just starting out and working on a limited income, it's no surprise why everyone's moved to outside the Henday.
Mm-hmm.
And so we just need to give that choice. So we don't stop Greenfield development. The city plan doesn't say we're going to stop Greenfield development. It says we're going to grow within our existing boundaries. So we're not going to annex any more land, but we're not going to prevent somebody to doing that. We're just going to also make sure that people can build more easily in mature neighborhoods like mine.
I get it. All right. Talk to me about 15-minute communities, because the idea is quite enticing and every community has different needs. I mean, you've talked already about the recreation center that you want to see built in the LRT line. What else is missing in the communities you represent?
Oh, well, so there was a good report done, I think it was the Globe and Mail back in November did it, where they calculated the percentage of people in each of the major cities that live within a 15-minute city or a 15-minute community. And in Edmonton, it's only 15% of us that live in that. And I'm actually fortunate. I live right in an area that has access to that. And so what it's all about is just, again, back to choice, not forcing a lifestyle, but making sure that if you wanted to live in a community, that you would have the availability of all of the programs and services and amenities within that 15-minute walk, bus, or bike ride. And I'll use myself as the example, being that I live in this area. I can walk out my door and within 15 minutes, I have access to my doctor, my dentist, my mechanic, multiple restaurants, clothing stores, grocery stores, my library, my parents, my mother-in-law. I have a seniors residence. I have all different types of housing options. And truly, if I wanted to, I never would have to leave this sort of 15-minute area from my home. Now, I still do. I like going to Costco and buying bulk food. So I'm still going to get in my car and go drive there. But I have the choice to live locally. Very few Edmontonians have that choice. So it goes back to, again, do we have a regulatory environment that allows for commercial use in our communities so that you can have that grocery store, that little corner store that has things? Do you have access to some scale recreation? It doesn't always need to be a big physical build or giant building. It can be small. Can we use our community league halls and program them a little bit differently? So the city plan, I think, really outlines the desire to say everyone should have that choice. Let's make sure our zoning bylaw is designed in a way that allows for that choice more easily. And again, somebody wants to drive around the city their entire life, that's cool. Like, we're not going to stop you from doing that. We just want you to say, hey, if you want it, why not have that choice?
All right. Let me ask you about Blatchford, because I think that it started off with a vision that a lot of people bought into, but I think it's had some hiccups along the way. Do you think that the city being its own developer is still the right way to go, or would you take a different approach there?
There's a lot of land that the city owns that I don't think we should own. There's a lot of greenfield land that we should not be in the business of building, new neighborhoods. And most of the mature areas where we own land, we should not be in the development. If I could, so I'm open to a different approach for Blatchford. I can also see why that one is the one where we might want to still stay involved because there were some certain environmental goals. But I also think you could achieve those exact same environmental outcomes through the sales agreement that you might do for a land like that. So I'm not closed off to the idea of taking a different approach for Blatchford. All I would say is that I can understand why, out of all of the land we own, that one's a little more unique than most anything else. Like, for me, let's get out of the business of development as a city. That is not our place to be. Blatchford, maybe let's look at some different approaches. But I'd also be okay with us continuing, because we are starting to see the first homes built, the first people move in. And so it took longer. But part of why it took longer is because council actually held back on it to relook at the district energy system. If you go back to when we started a bit of a delay, it's because had we gone in with a full district energy to deal with everything, including peak load, the cost to do that would have been substantially more. So we said, well, if we're talking about dealing with peak load, why not look at solar? Why not look at wind? Why not look at those other things that give you the exact same outcome but have a substantially lower cost? So it was delayed a little bit by design, part of it due to the market. But I see a lot of potential in it, whether we're doing it or whether someone else is doing it with a sales agreement that requires those type of environmental outcomes. I'm pretty indifferent to it.
All right. So you mentioned solar, so I should ask you about the controversial solar project in the River Valley. It was a split decision, 7-6. I can't remember what side you were on. You should
I
tell
was
us.
on the 6.
You were on the 6, so you were opposed to it. So do you think that that was the right decision, or do you think it should be reconsidered?
Well, I obviously voted against it, so I didn't think it was the right decision. But I also don't think, I feel like two camps really emerged quite quickly. Like, how dare you ever consider this, or you should never do it at all. And I can see why the 7 members of council voted in favor of it. It is land that was designated for future expansion for our water treatment. So, on one page, I could see why somebody might say, well, if it's going to be used for something anyways, why not in the interim use it for that? Why I ultimately said no is that the land wasn't zoned for that yet, which means it was still zoned as parkland. And what I thought about is that while we may need it in the future, technology also might advance over the years that may render that need obsolete. And therefore, if I was thinking about it, is it right today to rezone River Valley land into a use that maybe 30 years from now might not actually be needed? And so I came down on the side of I didn't think it was the right thing to do. I voted against it. I understand why those voted in favor of it. Whether it should be revisited. I mean, gosh, municipal government has such a track record of revisiting every single decision. And, I think there comes a point where you have to say, I think there's a legal challenge, and great, let that go through. But the Valley Line West LRT has been talked about for 12 years before we finally signed the contract. Blatchford was talked about for years and years and years. And I just think that there's nothing wrong with a second look at things, or really doing your due diligence. But I think there comes a point where there are decisions that have been made that I don't support. But my goal is not to try to relitigate every single thing I didn't support. Sometimes when those decisions have been made, my approach should be, how do I make that succeed? It might not be what I wanted. It might not be what I think that the city needs, but I'm going to try to help make sure that succeeds as best as possible. So,
all right.
Yeah.
Let me ask you then about another one with the drop of the residential speed limits to 40 kilometers per hour. Some want to go 30 kilometers per hour. What's your take on that? What would you like to see?
Well, while I think there is a argument to be made for why you might have the local roads at 30, particularly those that are very narrow and where one car can sort of get through at any given time, council made their decision. We just decided on 40. I'm fully supportive of that. I don't see the need to go and revisit that decision, even though I think there are some areas where that would work really well. 40 in my mind is far more reasonable on those. And again, we have to say it a million times, but we're not talking about our arterial roads. We're not talking about the roads we're commuting on. Those are all staying the set speed. It is when you turn off that and you have entered into your community or your friend's community or your parents' community, that's the road that's going to come down to 40 kilometers an hour. So those roads in front of our homes. And I think that's an appropriate speed. I live on an arterial road, a 4-lane arterial road. It is very fair for that speed to be set higher than when you turn into my community and go past my neighbors' homes and schools, because it's not a 4-lane road. It's much more narrow. I think 40 makes sense. Okay,
let's talk about another policing issue, because there has been a defund the police movement, which is what they call themselves. But what does that mean to you? What do you think should be accomplished, and what would you like to see with the police budget?
Well, I think you said the thing that's most important. What does it mean to, because everyone has, there's 100 different definitions for what people mean when they say the term defund the police. And what I understand it to mean and how I have approached that phrase is making sure we're allocating the right resources to achieve the right outcomes, not to abolish the police, because I don't support that. We're not going to abolish the police. But we want to make sure we are doing everything possible to support community safety in our city. So I did support earlier reducing the increase for EPS. So they were scheduled to receive a $16.3 million increase in 2021. I supported them receiving an increase of $10.8 million. So it's a decrease from what they were originally approved, but it is a net increase and the only department in our city to get one this year. And what I wanted to see from that money is it being reallocated to other programs and services that would actually help reduce calls for service. And we have examples of that. We have Reach Edmonton, which does the 24/7 crisis diversion team. And we put in money to that. And we have the information and the data that shows by investing in that, we saw calls for policing go down due to the people that they're working with. I mentioned Ambrose Place earlier, and I'll just give one last stat, is that we saw that overall interactions by having folks in permanent supportive housing dropped by 46%. And most of the serious incidents were almost eliminated. So we actually saved on policing $480,000 a year by putting money into supportive housing. So when I hear that term, because it has been so polarized and politicized, what I actually talk about is, are we allocating the right resources to achieve the right outcomes? And we definitely need police. They need to be there to respond to things, but we also need to have proper social supports like the crisis diversion team, like supportive housing. And with that, we will actually help our police be able to focus on criminals versus focusing on those who are needing additional supports and care. So I support, and that's why I supported the review of the formula to say, if we're going to allocate what almost at this point is a guaranteed increase through the funding formula, should it be exclusively to police, or should it be to policing and other social programs and supports? And I think that is the right approach, because policing is our version of the provincial healthcare budget. The provincial healthcare budget is a runaway train and will never end until you deal with the proactive issues, the things that will actually help reduce, hospital visits, things like that. Police are phenomenal at what they do, but they are primarily a reactive service. And there you have to ask, what are we doing to proactively help so they don't have to respond to every single thing? And some things that they aren't, I've talked to some of the police officers, and some are really upset about this conversation, and some are like, I don't really feel comfortable responding to a mental health call. So how do we make sure they're better supported to do what they want and at the same time achieve better outcomes? So that's why I support the work on this. But yeah, we're not going to abolish the police. I don't think that is a reasonable approach, but I do think, like with every department, no department should be given a blank check for an increase every year. Everyone should have metrics, targets, outcomes, to things that we can follow closely to make sure we are achieving what we want.
Perfect. Thanks so much for that perspective. I only have a couple questions left. The next one is on a bit of a lighter note, because I'm looking at a picture of the think tank downtown library. So, love it or hate it?
I don't hate it, but I don't love it. Like, to me, it's just like one of those, like, oh, it's there, it exists. It's not what I would have loved. I really don't like the art gallery design, but I appreciate, like, there are folks who love it. I just, when I see that one, I don't like. I saw the think tank and thought, it's fine.
All right. Yeah. Let me just, in closing, ask one last question, because there are times, and probably have been times, many times over the years, that the administration recommends a decision that is best for the city as a whole, but your constituents might want you to vote the other way. So it's really just the role, how you see your role as a council member. What do you do in those circumstances?
Well, fortunately, I would say I have found that to be very rare, where we are presented with a decision that is best for the city, but not best for the ward. But I think my role as a councillor, because, and I don't even think, the oath we take as councillors is to make decisions that are best for the entire city. But I think our role as a councillor is to make sure we are strongly advocating for why this is important or why it isn't important. And we need to bring that perspective, be very vocal about it. And there are times where I have voted against the majority of council because I felt that the position that was being brought forward actually had a net negative to the city, even though the rest said they felt it did. But there's an example of like when we had to pull back on the Lewis Farms Rec Center. I didn't love having to cast a ballot that said, we no longer have the construction budget to do this, but we no longer have the construction budget to do it. So I voted to not proceed with construction because we didn't have the money. That was worse for the ward. It's the right decision for the city. But then what I did is I went and put forward a motion that said, let's go see if we can partner with nonprofits or other partner organizations to build. So I think that's the other way a councillor can come into it, is to say, even if something doesn't go the way that your residents want, you can bring other ideas forward to try to help address those gaps. So rarely is it an either or scenario, but even when it is, we have a role in a way to help produce change.
All right. Well, thanks so much for the conversation today. I appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
That is Andrew Knack, your council member for Ward 1, Nakota Isga.